My name is Michelle Powell, and I'm 28 years old, a newly graduated nurse with big dreams. When my mom died 16 years ago, I moved in with my Aunt Kathleen, who constantly reminded me I was a financial burden. The envelope I received after my college graduation wasn't a congratulatory card, but a detailed $85,000 invoice for raising me. Now sitting in this courtroom as my own aunt sues me for my childhood expenses. I wonder how life led us here. Before I tell you what happened that day, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you've ever been betrayed by someone who claimed they loved you. Before everything fell apart, my childhood was filled with warmth and love. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a little two-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city. The walls were thin, the radiators clanged in the winter, and the kitchen counters were old laminate that had yellowed with time. But to me, that apartment felt like the safest place in the world because that's where my mother was. Her name was Sarah, and she worked as an EMT. My father had died in a car accident when I was just 2 years old, so I never had real memories of him, just faded photographs and the occasional story my mom would tell me before bed. She used to say he had the kindest eyes and that he would have adored watching me grow up. My mother worked long, unpredictable shifts, sometimes coming home at 3 in the morning, her uniform wrinkled and smelling faintly of antiseptic and smoke. But no matter how tired she was, she always found the energy to give me a hug, ask about my day, or sit with me while I ate dinner she had prepped before leaving for her shift. We didn't have much money, and I knew it even as a child. Most of my clothes came from thrift stores, and I learned early to ignore the fact that other kids at school had brand new sneakers while mine had scuffed soles and mismatched laces. But Mom never let me feel poor. She had this way of turning every little thing into something special, so I grew up surrounded not by wealth, but by warmth. On Sundays, we made homemade pizza together. She would roll out the dough on our chipped counter, dusting the surface with flour while I pressed my tiny hands into the soft ball, trying to copy her movements. She always let me choose the toppings. Sometimes I'd pile everything on pepperoni, onions, olives, even pineapple, and she would laugh and call it Michelle's disaster pizza. We'd sit on the couch later with paper plates in our laps, watching movies she borrowed from the shop. The waterfront was another ritual. Whenever she had a free morning, she'd take me down to the river with a bag of stale bread, and we'd feed the seagulls together. I used to squeal when they swooped low, their wings brushing so close I thought they might carry me away. She'd laugh, throw her head back, and tell me to hold my ground because life was just like those birds. It might scare you at first, but it was never as dangerous as it looked if you stood tall. And then there were the Christmases. Even when money was so tight she could barely afford groceries, my mom always found a way to make it magical. She would decorate the apartment with strands of old lights, half of them flickering, and make hot cocoa with extra marshmallows. Every year, without fail, she gave me books. Not toys, not gadgets, but books. Each one carefully chosen for me. Reading is the key to the future, she'd tell me as I tore off the wrapping paper. I remember one year she gave me a thick copy of a medical encyclopedia meant for kids. I must have been 8 years old, but I sat on the floor flipping through pages filled with diagrams of the human body, fascinated. She leaned over my shoulder, pointing out the pictures of lungs and hearts, explaining in simple terms how they worked. I was mesmerized. That was when I first decided I wanted to be like her, a medic, someone who saved lives. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were times when I felt the absence of a father more sharply, like at school events when other kids had both parents clapping in the audience, or on Father's Day when I had to make a card for a man I couldn't remember. But Mom always found a way to soften the sting. She told me it was okay to grieve, but that love mattered more than anything else, and I had more of that than many kids with 2 parents ever did. When I turned 12, my mom started coughing more than usual. At first, I thought it was just a stubborn cold, the kind that lingered during Portland's damp winters. But weeks went by, and the cough didn't stop. It grew deeper, harsher, and sometimes it left her breathless. She tried to hide it from me, turning her face away when she coughed into her sleeve, but I noticed. I noticed everything. Her once bright eyes began to look tired, with bruised shadows underneath that no amount of makeup could cover. I'd peek into her purse sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking, and I saw bottles of pills, names I couldn't pronounce, with instructions written in neat pharmacist's handwriting. She told me they were vitamins, but I wasn't naive anymore. Something was wrong. The day she came home from the doctor's office and sat me down, I felt my stomach twist before she even opened her mouth. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "Michelle, honey," she said softly, her hands wrapped around mine. "The doctors found something in my lungs." I remember staring at her, waiting for her to say it was something they could fix with medicine or surgery. But her voice broke as she added, "It's cancer. And it's not the kind they can cure." Terminal. That word lodged itself in my brain, cold and merciless. I was only 12, and suddenly I had to face the reality that my mother, the strongest person I knew, was not invincible. From that day forward, everything changed. Our little apartment turned into a place of quiet routines centered around her illness. I became her caregiver without even realizing it. I cooked simple meals, scrambled eggs, soup from a can, sometimes pasta if I was feeling brave in the kitchen. I wrote down the times for her medication in a little notebook, making check marks after each pill so we wouldn't forget. Some nights, I helped her shuffle from the couch to the bathroom, holding her arms so she wouldn't fall. It was exhausting, but I never complained. I felt like it was my duty, my way of giving back for all the sacrifices she had made for me. At school, I pretended everything was fine. I did my homework, I answered questions in class, I smiled at friends. But the moment I walked through our apartment door, I carried a weight no child should ever have to bear. Mom tried to stay strong for me. Even on her worst days, when the pain was etched across her face, she would still ask me about school, about my friends, about what book I was reading. She wanted me to believe that life would go on. And in a way, I clung to that belief too. But as the months passed, her body weakened. The woman who used to dance with me in the living room on Friday nights now sat wrapped in blankets, shivering even when the heater was turned up high. October came that year with its usual rain. The days grew shorter, and the gray skies seemed to press down on us inside our little apartment. Mom's condition worsened quickly. Hospice nurses began visiting, their calm professionalism a reminder that we were nearing the end. They showed me how to help her sit up when she struggled, how to make her more comfortable, how to recognize the signs that time was running out. I tried to be brave. I tried to believe that maybe she would last longer than they said. But deep down, I knew. Each day, she slipped a little further away from me. Then came that rainy October evening I will never forget. The sound of raindrops tapped against the window, steady and relentless, like a clock counting down. Mom lay in her bed, her breath shallow, her hand resting in mine. I remember how small her hand felt, so fragile, nothing like the strong hands that once pulled me close after a bad dream. I sat beside her, whispering to her even though I wasn't sure if she could hear me anymore. I told her I loved her. I told her I would make her proud, that I would become a nurse one day, just like she had inspired me to dream. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, and she gave me the faintest smile. She squeezed my hand weakly, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. And then, slowly, her chest rose one last time and stilled. I sat frozen, my heart pounding in my ears, unable to process what had just happened. The rain outside seemed louder, echoing the silence in the room. My mother was gone. I was 12 years old, holding the hand of the only parent I had ever truly known, as she slipped away from me forever. That night, my world collapsed. I cried until my body ached, until there were no tears left. I wanted her back more than anything, but all I had was the imprint of her hand in mine and the promise I had made, to be strong, to live a life that would make her proud. But I didn't yet know how alone I was about to be. The day of my mother's funeral felt like a blur. I remember the rain, steady and cold, falling on black umbrellas that dotted the cemetery like dark flowers. People whispered condolences, pressed my shoulder, handed me tissues, but their faces all blurred together. The only thing I could see clearly was the casket that held my whole world. That was when Kathleen appeared. Kathleen was my mother's younger sister, though you would never have guessed it by the way she carried herself. Where my mother had been practical and unpretentious, Kathleen always made an entrance. She arrived at the funeral in a sleek black coat that looked expensive, her high heels sinking slightly into the damp ground. I hadn't seen her often growing up. She lived in Seattle and only visited maybe twice a year. But when she came, she always brought gifts that seemed meant less for me and more for display. Designer perfume I was too young to use, a handbag my mom had to store away, a bracelet that sparkled but felt foreign on my wrist. I remember her leaning down toward me at the graveside, her perfume heavy, her lips brushing my hair in a kiss that felt more like a performance than affection. Poor Michelle, she murmured loud enough for others to hear. Don't you worry, sweetie. Aunt Kathleen will take care of you now. At 12 years old, raw with grief, I didn't know how to react. I just nodded, clutching the damp tissue in my hand, wishing my mother would walk up behind me and tell everyone it was a mistake. But she didn't, and Kathleen straightened her posture, scanning the mourners as though she wanted them all to witness her generosity. By the time we returned to the church hall for the reception, Kathleen had taken control. She stood with a plate of food she barely touched, speaking to relatives and neighbors with a practiced air. I'll be bringing Michelle to Seattle, she announced, her voice carrying easily over the room. She'll be like family with us. It's what Sarah would have wanted. I remember standing in the corner, holding a paper cup of watered-down punch, listening as if the words were being spoken about some other girl. My grandmother, frail and hunched, sat in a chair nearby, nodding weakly as if she had no choice. She already had heart problems, and though she loved me deeply, it was clear to everyone she couldn't take on raising a 12-year-old alone. Social services got involved almost immediately after the funeral. They came to our apartment, looked around at the boxes of my mother's belongings, and asked me questions that made me feel like I was being tested. Did I feel safe with my aunt? Did I want to live with her? I didn't know how to answer. Saying no to Kathleen didn't feel like an option. She was the adult, and she was already presenting herself as my savior. She knew how to play the part. She talked about her big house in Seattle, about the stability she and her husband could provide, about their teenage daughter Angela who would love having a cousin around. She painted a picture of opportunity, of a bright new chapter. And to outsiders, it must have sounded convincing. Social services believed her promises, and my grandmother's frailty left no alternatives. I was told, gently but firmly, that I would be moving to Seattle. The day I packed up my things was one of the hardest of my life. I put my books into a box, folded my clothes into a suitcase, and carefully wrapped the photo of my mother and me at the waterfront, the one where we were laughing with seagulls circling behind us. Every item I touched carried memories of her. Leaving the apartment felt like leaving her behind all over again. Kathleen arrived in her shiny SUV, her nails manicured, her lips painted a deep shade of red. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" she asked, her tone almost cheerful. I wanted to scream that I wasn't ready, that I would never be ready, but instead I nodded and climbed into the back seat. As we drove away, I pressed my forehead against the window, watching my old neighborhood blur into the distance. I realized, with a hollow ache, that from this point forward, everything was going to be different. Kathleen glanced at me through the rearview mirror, her smile thin and satisfied. "You'll love Seattle," she said. "You'll be part of a real family now." Her words echoed in my head, sharp and unsettling. Because deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that what she meant by family was nothing like what my mother had given me. And as the rain followed us north on the highway, I felt the first stirrings of a fear I didn't yet understand, that I was stepping into a life where love would be replaced by obligation, and where the promises made in front of others were nothing but a show. I remember the shock of seeing Kathleen's house for the first time, a 2-story mansion with pale stone pillars and a circular driveway lined with trimmed boxwoods. The fountain in the middle actually ran, even in the drizzle, like it had been instructed not to care about the weather. Her husband, Mark, parked a shiny new car beneath the porte-cochere, the kind of car that hummed instead of growled, with leather that smelled like money. Angela, their daughter, had a room upstairs with mirrored walls, ballet bars, and a speaker system that made the floor tremble when she rehearsed. They called it her studio, like she was already famous. I was given the storage room off the laundry. Someone had pushed a cot against the wall and slid a narrow dresser beside it. The single window faced the side of the neighbor's garage. If I stood on tiptoe, I could see a sliver of sky. A bare bulb hung from a pole chain, and there was a faint, permanent scent of detergent and damp cardboard. Someone had tried to make it cheerful by taping up a floral calendar from last year. I ran my fingers over the peeling corners and told myself it was temporary. I told myself lots of things then. For the first week, I tried to believe I had been rescued. Kathleen brought home a bag of new clothes, 2 blouses that didn't fit, a skirt too tight to breathe in, and a sweater so itchy I could feel it just looking at it. "You'll grow into them," she said briskly, even though I was already 12 and the blouses were clearly 2 sizes off. She gave me a tour of the kitchen like a realtor. The double ovens, the warming drawer, the pantry as big as our old living room closet. "We do things properly here," she added, and smiled in a way that was not really a smile. At dinner, everything gleamed. There were cloth napkins and heavy silverware and place cards with our names in a looping script. Angela talked about her dance competitions, about costumes and judges, about a girl who cried when she missed a turn. "You have to have discipline," Angela said, spearing a perfect piece of salmon. "Some people just don't." Kathleen looked at me then, quick and sharp, as if the sentence had landed where she intended. The second week, the chores started. At first it was small, loading the dishwasher, wiping the counters, taking out the trash. "Pitch in," Kathleen said, her voice slight. "Everyone does their part." But everyone turned out to mean me. The list on the fridge grew each morning: vacuum upstairs, dust the baseboards, scrub the downstairs bathroom, fold laundry, iron marked shirts. By Saturday, there was a chart with boxes to tick and a note at the bottom: "Don't forget Angela's leotards, delicate cycle, air dry only." I did them all because I didn't know what would happen if I didn't. Angela lived like a princess whose feet never touched the floor. She floated from car to studio to vanity, leaving a trail of bobby pins, glitter, and compliments she expected to hear echoed back. Ribbons hung in neat rows above her bed. Trophies stood like soldiers on her dresser. Sometimes she'd blink at me in the mirror while I gathered her laundry. "Hand wash the tights," she'd say without turning, as if speaking to a reflection rather than a person. "They snag if you're careless." The refrain started soon after: "Remember, you cost us a lot. Food, clothes, school, none of this is free." Kathleen never raised her voice. She said it casually, like a reminder to turn off lights, like a law of nature I hadn't learned yet. She'd pass me in the hallway and add, "Just so we're clear," as if clarity were the gift she was giving. Once, as I was scrubbing the grout in the guest bath, she leaned against the door frame and said, "Soap is expensive. Use less." I nodded, my fingers pruned and raw, and wondered how much less clean the tile was supposed to be. Mornings began before anyone else woke up. I learned which steps creaked and which cabinets slammed. I learned to pack Angela's dance bag precisely: point shoes, backup shoes, rosin, hairpins, 2 pairs of tights, a clean water bottle, snacks that didn't crumble. I learned the sound of Mark's car leaving for work and the sound of Kathleen's heels clicking toward the mudroom when she was already running late. "Michelle," she'd call, not looking up from her phone, "there's lint on the stair runner." Run the handheld again. At school, I kept my head down. The neighborhood kids wore crisp uniforms and carried tablets in leather cases. Their mothers parked Range Rovers in a neat row after dismissal and hugged their children like they'd traveled across an ocean instead of a school day. I took the bus home and let myself in through the side door because the front was for guests. I'd hang my backpack on the hook labeled Michelle in tiny letters beneath a row of family initials that matched. Then I'd go straight to the chart on the fridge. Once I mustered the courage to ask Angela if she wanted help with her math homework. She laughed softly and tilted her head. "I have a tutor," she said, and her smile was reflective. "But you could fold the tutu skirts the right way. The netting gets sad if you fold it wrong." She meant crisp. She meant invisible. In the evenings, after I'd cleared dishes and loaded cycles and wiped the last water ring from the marble, I'd retreat to my storage room. I kept my mother's picture on the dresser and whispered goodnight to it the way I used to her. Some nights I'd spread my homework across the cot and try to focus while the washer thumped on the other side of the wall like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. I told myself to be grateful: a roof, meals, school. I repeated the words like a prayer until they sounded like someone else's relief. But hope wears down when comments accumulated. Don't forget, you're our responsibility. We've rearranged our lives for you. Be useful and this will go smoothly. On Sundays, when Angela had early rehearsals, I'd rise in the dark to make her oatmeal and slice strawberries the way she liked them, thin and even, like coins. She never said thank you. She would flit past, air-kiss Kathleen's cheek, and dash out the door, her bag already waiting because I had placed it there. One night, we had company. The dining room glowed. The good china came out. Kathleen laughed at the end of the table, her bracelets chiming softly. Our hands are full these days, she told a woman in pearls. Teen rehearsals, Mark's new project, and, well, Michelle. The woman's eyes slid to me and then away. You're such a saint, she murmured. Kathleen smiled, practiced and modest. Under the table, I pressed my palms together until my knuckles ached. But despite everything, I kept trying to earn my place anyway. I memorized their coffee orders and how hot each person liked their shower. I wiped fingerprints from the stainless steel before anyone could point them out. Each task finished bought me one more hour of peace, one less reminder that I was a cost to be justified. I got my first job at 16, after school and on weekends, at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the bus stop. The manager liked that I showed up early and didn't roll my eyes when customers changed their order 3 times. The shop smelled like cinnamon and espresso, and for a few hours a day I could pretend I belonged to that warm, humming world where people greeted me by name and tipped with a smile. I brought home my first paycheck folded carefully in my pocket, already planning what notebooks I'd buy for biology and how many weeks it would take to save for new sneakers. Kathleen saw the envelope before I could even put it away. She didn't ask how my first week went or whether I liked the job. She lifted the flap with a nail and scanned the numbers like she was reading a bill. Since you're earning money, she said, arranging the words the way she arranged place cards, pay up. For $100 a month for room and board. For $100. My brain did the math before my mouth caught up. That was more than half my pay after taxes. I stood there holding my backpack like a shield and tried to string together reasons why this didn't make sense. Why a guardian who had taken me and shouldn't charge rent to a kid still doing algebra homework. But her face was closed, and I already knew what it meant when Kathleen closed doors. So I said, okay. I started budgeting like an adult, even though I still needed a parent signature for school forms. Every month, I counted tips and clocked hours and kept a tiny ledger in a spiral notebook I hid inside a library book. $400 for room and board. Bus pass. Lunches if I couldn't sneak leftovers. $5 set aside for laundry because the detergent we used apparently didn't include me. I learned to stretch my money as if it were elastic. I mended socks, thrifted jeans, and said no to anything that involved an entry fee. When friends invited me to the movies, I told them I was working. When yearbook forms came around, I left the line for personal message blank and pretended I didn't care. At home, I did the chores and handed over the cash on the first of the month. Kathleen would slide the bills into a white envelope and put it in the kitchen drawer with the warranties and appliance manuals. She rarely looked at me when I placed the money there, only at the envelope as it closed, as if that was the point of me. Good, she'd say, and that was the end of it. Angela didn't pay for anything. She floated through rehearsals and fittings like a sponsored athlete whose life was covered, every meal prepped, every bag packed. When I ironed Mark's shirts late at night, I'd hear Angela's laughter from upstairs and think about how noise travels differently when it belongs to people who don't worry about bills. Then one afternoon, everything shifted. Kathleen asked me to fetch a folder from her office, the small room off the hallway with glass doors, where she kept a white desk and a printer that jammed if you breathed on it. The blue folder labeled utilities, she said, jangling her car keys. Bottom drawer, left side. And don't make a mess. She was running late for a hair appointment. I walked in careful as a cat. The office smelled like a department store perfume counter. The bottom drawer wasn't locked. I found the blue folder quickly, but beside it sat a stack of envelopes with the state logo and bold letters, benefit report enclosed. The top one had my name on it. My stomach cooled in that slow, descending way it does when you know you're about to learn something you can't unlearn. I shouldn't have opened it. I know that. But I did. Inside were statements showing monthly transfers to Kathleen, $1,375 marked for my support as a survivor benefit. There were months and months of them, maybe years, neatly filed. Each page had the same cold line, disbursement to guardian for care of minor, Michelle Powell. I felt the floor tilt. I remembered every time I'd handed over my $400, every time she'd said food and clothes and school aren't free. I reached for the next envelope, then the next. In another stack, I found an insurance letter addressed to Kathleen from a company I vaguely recognized from the papers in my mother's file box. My mother, Sarah, had named me beneficiary of a small life insurance policy, but the guardian of record would manage it until I turned 18. The letter itemized a payout of $40,000. My name again. A note. Funds released to guardian for the benefit of minor child. My hands shook as I looked for the money itself. There was none, of course. But there were clues. A fat file labeled kitchen renovation, glossy brochures with marble countertops circled in ink, a contract with a date that matched the month after the insurance payout, a check copy for a deposit to a company with a tasteful logo. Tucked behind it, a folder marked travel. 2 boarding passes to Las Vegas on a cheap airline, 3 hotel confirmations, and a stack of casino club mailers addressed to Kathleen, congratulating her on tier status and valued play. I sat frozen, the blue utilities folder forgotten on my lap. The office was quiet in the late afternoon light, and my breath sounded too loud. The state paying $1,375 a month for my support while I paid her $400 from a barista job. My mother's last protection for me poured into countertops and slot machines. My life reduced to line items someone else enjoyed. The anger came slow and then all at once. It rose from somewhere deep, from every chore chart and every remember you cost us, from every time I swallowed my words to keep the peace. I pressed my fingers to my temples until stars flashed behind my eyes. I wanted to march into the salon and wave the papers at her, to demand answers in front of the mirror where she watched herself. Instead, I slid the papers back exactly as I'd found them. I took the utilities folder and closed the drawer carefully. My hands had steadied. When Kathleen got home, I handed her the folder in the hallway while she fussed with her hair. "Took you long enough," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Next time be quicker." That night, I lay awake in the storage room, listening to the wash cycle thump behind the wall. I thought about my mother's handwriting in my old birthday cards, and the way she had always said reading is the key to the future. And she was right. Reading had unlocked something I couldn't ignore. The future I saw now wasn't the one Kathleen described when she posed as a martyr. It was an equation, and the math no longer worked. School became my lifeline, the one place where I could breathe without the constant pressure. I threw myself into studying with a hunger that surprised even me. It wasn't just about good grades, it was about survival. If I excelled, I could find a way out. Every A on my report card felt like a secret act of rebellion against Kathleen, a small crack in the wall she had built around me. I dreamed of medical school, of following in my mother's footsteps. Whenever biology class discussed anatomy or first aid, I pictured my mom in her EMT uniform, saving lives with steady hands. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, I could honor her memory. But Kathleen had no patience for dreams. She would sneer whenever she saw me bent over a textbook. "All that studying won't put food on the table," she'd mutter. "And don't forget, you still owe us. None of this comes for free." It was during my sophomore year that I met Mr. Myers, my biology teacher. He was tall, gray-haired, and always smelled faintly of chalk dust, but he had a way of making you feel like your ideas mattered. He noticed how much time I spent in the lab after school and one day asked me to stay behind. "You've got potential, Michelle," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose. Don't let anyone make you feel small. Document everything and start looking for scholarships now. There's money out there for kids who work hard. Those words stuck with me. I started keeping a binder, copies of my grades, certificates from science fairs, even notes about the extra shifts I worked at the coffee shop. At first it felt silly, but as the pages grew, the binder became my proof that I was more than just the girl cleaning bathrooms in Kathleen's house. Balancing school and work wasn't easy. My shifts at the coffee shop left me exhausted, and Kathleen's endless demands drained whatever energy I had left. But I carved out hours late at night, my desk lamp flickering as I reviewed flashcards and wrote essays. Coffee became my constant companion. Some nights I cried into my notes, wondering if it was worth it. My classmates didn't know the full story, but a few became my allies. Samantha from math class shared her old SAT prep books with me. Daniel, who sat next to me in chemistry, sometimes gave me rides home when I missed the bus after late shifts. They probably thought they were doing small favors, but to me, it was like someone had thrown me a lifeline. By junior year, I was at the top of my class. I joined the science club and competed in regional competitions. Mr. Myers pushed me to apply for summer programs at local universities, where I got to work in real labs for the first time. I still remember the thrill of holding a pipette, the smell of ethanol in the air, the way the white lab coat made me feel like I belonged somewhere bigger than Kathleen's mansion. Of course, Kathleen tried to sabotage me at every turn. When acceptance letters for summer programs arrived, she rolled her eyes. Waste of time. You should be working extra shifts instead of playing with test tubes. She threatened to pull me out, but the programs were fully funded, and the teachers intervened. For the first time, she couldn't block my way. Senior year was the hardest. Between AP classes, college applications, and working to cover Kathleen's so-called rent, I barely slept. There were nights I'd fall asleep with my head on my notebook and wake up to the alarm, panicked that I hadn't finished my homework. But I refused to let exhaustion break me. When scholarship season began, I applied to everything I could find. Local grants, national competitions, programs for orphans, women in science. If there was an application, I filled it out. Mr. Myers wrote glowing recommendation letters, and my binder of documents turned into a weapon. The day the acceptance letter from nursing school arrived, I sat on the bus staring at the envelope in disbelief. A full grant tuition, housing, books. I had done it. So I kept the letter hidden for a week, savoring the secret. When I finally told Kathleen, she laughed coldly. Nursing? You think that's impressive? Don't forget who fed you all these years. You owe me, Michelle. When you start earning money, you'll pay me back. Her words stung, but I brushed them off. At the time, I thought it was just bluster, another way for her to remind me she held power. I packed my things, said a quiet goodbye to the storage room I had called a bedroom, and left for college. The day I walked onto campus, carrying my binder and a secondhand suitcase, I felt lighter than I had in years. Finally, the future was mine. But what I didn't know was that Kathleen's words weren't just empty threats. By the time the letter found me, I had been on the surgical floor long enough to measure my days in beeping monitors and the soft shuffle of rubber soles at 4 a.m. I rented a room in a walk-up in Queens, kept my scrubs folded in tidy stacks, and stored my mother's photograph in the top drawer where I could see it before each shift. Life was not easy, but it was mine. Then Kathleen's name appeared in the return address, perched above a Midtown law firm logo that made my stomach drop the moment I saw it. Inside was a crisp demand letter on heavy paper that smelled faintly of toner and arrogance. Dear Miss Powell, it began, like we were strangers meeting for the first time. The paragraphs that followed had a rhythm of accusation and entitlement, repayment for upbringing and expenses, room and board, medical costs, extraordinary parental responsibilities. The sum $85,000 sat on the page like a dare. I reread it 3 times at my tiny kitchen table, then a 4th time just to confirm I hadn't misunderstood. $85,000? For the privilege of surviving? I thought of the storage room that passed for a bedroom. My hands shook so hard I had to study the letter against the table. After the first wave of nausea passed, anger arrived, clean and bracing. I poured it into action. The next morning, between a 7 a.m. dressing change and noon meds, I called the number a social worker at the hospital had once pressed into my palm for when you need someone who understands guardianship, not just contracts. That's how I met Mr. Wallace. He was in his 50s, bow tie slightly crooked, eyes sharp in a way that made me feel both seen and protected. He listened without interrupting while I laid out my life like a set of instruments on a sterile tray: the funeral, the move to Seattle, the rent, the discovery in the office drawer, the survivor benefits, the insurance payout for $40,000, the marble countertops that bloomed the same month the check cleared. When I finished, he tapped the corner of the demand letter with a pen. "We'll need to gather everything," he said. "All of it. Documents talk louder than memories." He slid a yellow legal pad toward me and drew 4 columns across the top: benefits, insurance, payments by you, witnesses. Next to the last one, he added in smaller letters, anything you wrote down at the time. I opened the backpack I had carried for years like a talisman and placed on his desk the binder Mr. Myers had once told me to keep. It looked humble, plastic cover scuffed, metal rings slightly bent, but inside was a record of my life. Grade reports, acceptance letters, scholarship awards, the ledger where I had tracked each $400 payment with a date, month after month. I had stuffed photocopies of those benefit letters, too, taken in a rush the day Kathleen sent me hunting for utilities. Mr. Wallace leafed through the pages slowly, the way a surgeon studies scans before an operation. "Good," he murmured. "Very good. You did what most people never think to do." He looked up. "We're going to respond firmly. And we're going to ask for disclosure on their end. Bank statements, deposit records, guardianship filings. If she took survivor benefits, there's a paper trail. If she managed an insurance payout for your benefit, there should be a trust accounting. If there isn't, that's useful." "Useful," I echoed, tasting the word like medicine I hoped would work. That week became a quiet campaign. I worked my shifts, charted vitals, and on my breaks I was a detective. I called the coffee shop manager from high school and asked for payroll archives. She found them in a dusty banker's box and mailed copies with a sticky note that said, "Proud of you, kid." I visited the bank where I had once cashed tips and requested statements from the years I lived in Kathleen's house, highlighting withdrawals that matched the dates in my ledger. I emailed Mr. Myers, now retired in Arizona, and asked if he would write a statement about the conversations we had during those years. His response arrived 2 days later, warm and precise, recalling how I'd paid rent to a guardian he had always found curiously aloof. On my day off, I took the subway downtown to request state documentation about survivor benefits. I waited under fluorescent lights while a clerk retrieved microfilmed archives and printed them in a stack that grew heavy in my hands. Each page sang the same refrain: monthly transfers to Kathleen for the support of minor Michelle Powell. The figure $1, $375 repeated like a heartbeat line across years. Mr. Wallace's paralegal, Nina, helped me build a timeline. We sat at a long table, arranging documents in rows that turned into a map of my adolescence. Here was the month the kitchen contractor was paid. Here was the same month's insurance disbursement. Here were the flight confirmations to Las Vegas, and the little calendar where Angela had marked Vegas in glitter pen. Every time I grew tired, Nina would slide a peppermint across the table and say, "Paper is power." I pocketed the candies like charms. Kathleen's attorney sent emails in a tone I recognized, polite disdain dressed as professionalism. He attached a spreadsheet of household expenditures, lumping my existence into neat categories: food, $X, utilities, $Y, transportation, $Z. Client assumed full responsibility for Ms. Powell's upbringing. One line proclaimed, as if I had been a stray dog she'd rescued. Mr. Wallace returned each message with courteous requests: receipts, statements, guardianship filings, proof of payment. Days passed and the attachments never matched the assertions. Vague summaries arrived, but not the ledgers behind them. I slept badly, dreaming of folders that wouldn't close and doors that wouldn't open. In the mornings, I tied my hair back, clipped my badge, and returned to patients who needed wound care and calm words. I learned I could hold fear in one hand and confidence in the other without dropping either. One night, after a brutal shift, I found an email from Mr. Wallace with the subject line, "Draft Response." I made tea and read it 3 times. It was unfailingly polite and devastating in its clarity. It listed each category of funds Kathleen had received for my care, month by month. It included my ledgers of $400 payments with copies of checks. It referenced statutes about guardianship duties and the impermissibility of charging a minor rent from her own low-wage earnings when state benefits already covered support. At the end, it requested mediation or dismissal of the claim with prejudice and preserved our right to pursue remedies if necessary. Is that a threat? I asked Mr. Wallace the next day, feeling suddenly 12 again and also very far from 12. "It's a boundary," he said simply. "You were a child. You don't repay a childhood. And if someone profited from yours, we don't let that stand unexamined." We filed the response by certified mail and electronically, each confirmation ping like a small exhale. There were still practicalities. Mr. Wallace walked me through what could happen next: discovery, depositions, maybe mediation, maybe a hearing. "It's a process," he said, "and it runs on calendars and patience." I marked dates in my planner next to shift schedules and reminded myself not to rehearse every possible outcome. My job was to keep showing up with documents, with truth, with the steady breath my mother had taught me to find when pain flared and panic hovered. When Kathleen's lawyer sent a follow-up letter, encouraging prompt settlement, Mr. Wallace answered with a packet thicker than a paperback novel. Inside were the statements, the benefits reports, and yes, the copies of the checks I had written in neat, frightened script. For room/board, the memo line said, as if I were a tenant and not a kid in a borrowed house. I sealed the envelope and handed it to the courier myself. As he disappeared into the lobby's revolving door, I felt the smallest click inside me, like a lock finally meeting its key. Whatever happened next, I wasn't that girl in the storage room anymore, begging to be counted. I barely slept the night before the hearing. I kept seeing the letterhead, the numbers, the signature that wasn't mine. By morning, I'd memorized the cracks in my apartment ceiling and the rhythm of the radiator. I dressed in my best navy suit, the one I'd bought off-season with coupons, tucked my binder into a canvas tote, and took the subway downtown with a stomach that felt like it was filled with pins. The courthouse was colder than I expected. Fluorescent lights hummed. People whispered in small clusters like it was church, waiting to be called up for their turn with fate. Mr. Wallace met me in the hallway outside the courtroom, bow tie a little crooked, a thick accordion file under his arm. "Breathe," he said, not looking at me so I could collect myself without feeling watched. "We'll keep it simple. Facts first. Let the paper speak." Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of old wood. The judge, a patient-looking man with steady eyes and a tidy stack of files, took the bench. The clerk called the case. Kathleen sat at the plaintiff's table in a slate-gray dress and a string of pearls. Her lawyer, a man with perfect hair and a voice like a podcast host, leaned close to whisper in her ear. She didn't look at me. When proceedings began, her attorney stood and painted a portrait, a selfless aunt who had stepped in when tragedy struck, who had opened her home, provided meals and clothing, paid for tutors and medical appointments, sacrificed time and money. It was a performance delivered with solemn pauses. Kathleen dabbed her eyes with a tissue at precisely the right moments, her shoulders trembling just enough for the back row to notice. Ms. Marshall's generosity sustained Michelle for years, he concluded, turning slightly so the gallery could see his earnest profile. It is only fair that she be compensated for the extraordinary expenses she assumed. She is not asking for charity, she is asking for justice. She should be rewarded. Rewarded. The word curdled in my throat. I felt Mr. Wallace's fingertip tap the table near my elbow, one slow, grounding beat. Then it was our turn. Mr. Wallace rose, slid his glasses down his nose, and spoke in a voice that felt like a clean scalpel. "Your Honor, we have no wish to malign anyone's feelings. But this hearing is about facts, not performances. My client was a minor. Ms. Marshall was her guardian of record. And the record shows that Ms. Marshall was compensated, generously, by the state of Oregon and by an insurance policy meant for the child's benefit. He approached the bench with a thin binder we'd assembled piece by piece. With the court's permission. The judge nodded. Mr. Wallace handed it to the clerk, who passed it up. Statements of survivor benefits paid monthly to Ms. Marshall for Michelle Powell's support in the amount of $1,375 per month over multiple years. Insurance correspondence and disbursement records for a $40,000 policy held by Michelle's deceased mother, released to the guardian for the minor's benefit. Copies of checks written by Michelle, then a teenager working in a coffee shop, for room and board $400 each month to Ms. Marshall, while the survivor benefits were active. I watched the judge's eyes skim lines I knew by heart, my name, typed in official, Kathleen's name, printed beneath pay, the dates that matched the months I skipped the movies and patched my shoes. Every page slid across the wood like a soft accusation. Mr. Wallace didn't rush. Receipts and contracts for a kitchen renovation and travel, including multiple trips to Las Vegas, dated within the same period as the insurance disbursement. Affidavits from a teacher and an employer describing Michelle's condition at the time, worn clothing, self-funded school expenses, continued demands for rent. Across the room, Kathleen's attorney shifted, the confident tilt of his chin faltering. Kathleen kept dabbing her eyes, but the tissue hovered now uncertain, as if it no longer knew where it belonged. The judge turned another page, then took off his glasses and polished them with the hem of his robe, a small, unhurried gesture that made the room go quiet. "Counselor," he said to Mr. Wallace, "you're telling me the guardian received monthly state funds for the child's support and also demanded direct payment from the child?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Wallace replied, while also using an insurance payout intended for the child's benefit on home improvements and gambling travel. He didn't inflect the last words. He let the documents carry their own weight. The judge slid his glasses back on and looked at Kathleen's attorney. "Response?" There was a shuffle of papers, a throat cleared. "Your Honor, generosity takes many forms. Household expenses are complex. My client opened her home and—" "Do you have receipts?" the judge asked evenly, showing that the survivor benefits and insurance proceeds were used for the child's direct support, food, clothing, educational supplies, in the amounts claimed? A pause. "We have summaries." "Receipts," the judge repeated, not unkindly. "Invoices. Accounting." The attorney glanced at Kathleen. She stared at the tabletop, jaw set, pearl earring catching the light like a warning. Mr. Wallace lifted another document. If it assists the court, a timeline was created from the state disbursements, bank records, and credit card statements obtained in discovery. It totals the funds received for Michelle's support during the relevant years to just under $205,000. He set the page down gently, like a final instrument on a tray. Meanwhile, Michelle paid rent out of part-time earnings, bought her own school supplies, and wore the same winter coat for 3 seasons. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until my ribs ached. The courtroom had its own heartbeat now, hushed, waiting. The judge looked at the number again, nearly $205,000, and then at me. For a moment I felt 12, small and trying to stand tall in a kitchen that never smelled like home. Then I felt 28, my badge clipped to my pocket, my hands steady. He set the binder down. The room seemed to lean toward him. "Ms. Marshall," he said at last, voice level but edged with something I can only call moral clarity, "a child should not have to pay for being raised. That is the responsibility of the guardian, especially one paid for by the state. Not only is your claim dismissed, but it is also being referred to the prosecutor's office for investigation of fraud." His words landed like a gavel before the gavel. For a second, no one moved. Then a sound rippled through the benches, a collective inhale, a stifled gasp, the scrape of a shoe against tile. I heard someone whisper, "Oh my God," and the bailiff shot them a look. Kathleen went very still. The color drained from her face in a slow, unmistakable wave. Her mouth opened once, closed, then opened again without sound. The tissue in her hand sagged like a flag when the wind dies. She looked at her attorney, who was suddenly fascinated by the paperwork he hadn't produced. The judge tapped his pen once, efficiently, then addressed the clerk about the referral and the dismissal. He did not raise his voice or indulge in speeches. The documents had already said everything that mattered. As the bailiff called the next case, the courtroom's hush broke into a low, cautious chatter. People gathered their bags, pushed back benches, tried not to stare, and failed. I kept my eyes on the grain of the table, counting the fine lines like rings of a tree years marked, whether survived. Kathleen stood on unsteady legs. For a heartbeat, I thought she might turn to me with one last performance, one last accusation, one last after all I did. But she didn't. She swayed, caught herself on the edge of the table, and stared straight ahead as if the door were a finish line only she could see. Her pearls lay askew against her collarbone, the clasp rotated to the front. No one reached to fix it. Mr. Wallace touched my elbow, a silent stand, and we rose. Papers slid back into files with the soft, decisive sounds of closure. We stepped away from the table, away from the binder, away from the stage where she had rehearsed for years and finally run out of lines. The hallway felt warmer than when we'd entered. I could still hear the judge's voice in the air behind us, measured and final, the single sentence that changed the story I'd been told about my life. I didn't smile. Not yet. The moment was too big for one expression. I just breathed, deep and even, the way I'd taught frightened patients to breathe before a painful dressing change. Somewhere behind us, a door clicked shut. And in the echo, her silence said more than any speech she'd ever made. I left the courtroom a free woman. The hallway felt warmer than when I'd walked in, like the building had exhaled with me. Mr. Wallace squeezed my shoulder once, quiet, professional, and disappeared toward the elevators with his accordion file, already on to the next crisis. I stood by a high window, watching a patch of pale New York sky and the yellow flash of a cab turning the corner, and let the verdict sink all the way down to my bones. No more ledgers hanging over my head. No more phantom bills for existing. Outside, I bought a bottle of water from a cart I'd passed 100 times on my way to work and took the slow train back to Queens. The subway car rattled. A kid in a Spider-Man hoodie swung from the pole until his mother whispered his name. A man in paint-splattered boots slept with his chin on his chest. I looked at all of them and felt the strangest surge of tenderness, as if the whole city were a waiting room where we were finally being called by our real names. Back in my apartment, I took my mother's photograph from the drawer and set it on the kitchen table. It's over, I told her, though I knew she didn't need the update. I made tea the way she liked it, too strong, a squeeze of lemon, and sat until the steam faded and the light shifted across the wall. Work the next morning felt different, though nothing in the hallway had moved. I'm at a children's clinic now, an outpatient place that always smells like sanitizer. The families that come through our door live in the gray areas where love and worry wrestle. Some are doing their best and still falling short. Some are dangerous without meaning to be. Some are dangerous on purpose. Kids know the difference, even when they can't say it out loud. They sit on the paper-covered exam tables swinging their legs, telling me with their eyes what they won't risk telling anyone else. I take their temperatures and their stories. On my break, I sometimes sit in the stairwell with my lunch and open my old binder, the one Mr. Myers told me to start and Mr. Wallace later relied on. It's dog-eared and unglamorous, but I keep it as a reminder that paper can be a flashlight. I've added a new section: resources for scholarships, emergency funds, tenant rights. When a patient is old enough and the situation feels safe, I slide photocopies across to them like a secret map. My coworkers joke that I run on coffee and stubbornness. Maybe they're not wrong. But it's not revenge that gets me out of bed. It's memory and a promise I made on a rainy October night when the world went quiet. I couldn't save my mother. I couldn't make Kathleen love me more than she loved marble and praise. But what I can do now is stand between other children and the very worst version of that story. I've learned that real family is not the one that itemizes your meals or measures your worth in receipts. Real family looks like a retired teacher who answers your email from Arizona with kindness and detail. It looks like a paralegal who slides peppermints across a table because she can tell you're flagging. It looks like a judge who reads every page. It looks like a social worker who returns your call on her lunch break because she knows you're scared to go back home. Sometimes, at the end of a visit, a child lingers by the door and looks at me as if I might have one more thing to hand them, something that isn't a prescription or a lab slip. I don't make promises I can't keep. I don't tell them it will be easy or quick. I tell them what I needed to hear when I was their age. I tell them, there are people who will stand up for you. I will help you find them. And silently, I add the words that live in my chest like a small, bright pilot light. I was able to escape. And you can too. Family is important, there is no denying that. But it does not mean that someone can treat you like an asset to be used, manipulated, or billed for your existence. You are not a receipt, you are not a debt, and you are not someone else's investment to cash in when it suits them. For years, Kathleen made me feel like I owed her simply for breathing under her roof. She turned my survival into a ledger and my future into a contract. But walking out of that courtroom, I understood something I wish every child in a similar situation could know. Love that comes with a price tag is not love. It is control. And no matter how loudly someone says family comes first, if they are using that phrase to keep you small, then they are not protecting family, they are protecting their power. A real family is the teacher who tells you to hold on because you have talent. It is the lawyer who believes in you enough to stand up in a courtroom with the truth. It is the friend who listens, the colleague who covers your shift when you need rest, the stranger who says, I'm proud of you, without even knowing your name. Never allow anyone, even those closest to you, to dictate your fate through lies or emotional blackmail. You are worth more than the false debts they try to pin on you. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like someone in your family treated you as if you owed them your entire life? Or have you ever been made to feel like a debt instead of a person? Write your experience in the comments below, I will be reading them. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by someone you trusted. Together, we prove that survival is not shame, it is strength.